first of all, thank the viewers for joining us tonight at the Sugar Beach Resort, where a conference is just started this evening on corporate governance and sustainability. And we have with us as our guest, first of all, Professor Mervin King, who I suppose in a sense doesn't need introducing. He's somebody who Mauritians somewhere know, having been here in the past, to actually set up ethics for corporate governance. You've been here before, Professor King, and first of all, thank you very much for being here. Now, along with Professor King, we have George Langshin, who's the chairman of Mauritius Institute of Directors. George, please introduce yourself.
Yeah. I'm George Langshin, and I'm the president of the Mauritius Institute of Directors. Our existence is due to the fact that we want to promote good corporate governance in Mauritius.
Thank you. Now, next to George is Marian Barnor, who's from MRB Consulting in Ghana. Marian, please introduce yourself.
As I said, I'm Marian Barnor from Ghana. I'm a lawyer. I do a lot of work in corporate governance, and I chair Merchant Bank, Ghana.
And next to Professor King, there's Ansi Ramelow, who's the CEO for the Institute of Directors of South Africa, which I suppose the equivalent of George in South Africa. Please, Ansi, introduce yourself.
Good evening. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and we have a long and proud history in corporate governance. We've been involved since the inception of the first King report, and we see our role cut out for us in the future.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mahendra Jatam, who's the Vice Chairman of the Asian Centre on Corporate Governance and Sustainability. Could you please introduce yourself, Mahendra?
Yeah, my name is Mahendra Chauhan. I am Vice Chairman of Global Advisory Board of Asian Centre for Corporate Governance. This is a centre which was set up 10 years ago under the leadership of Mervin King, who is the Chairman of our Global Advisory Board. Our basic role is advocacy and to promote the cause of good governance and sustainability.
Thank you. Now, so far it's been a very technical talk when you've been introducing yourselves. I suppose my first question would be to you, Professor King. What is governance?
Well, governance is principles and practices which are equally applicable to all entities, which includes public entities and private sector entities, even a tennis club. And the principles of good governance are that one should act with intellectual honesty. Now that sounds like a very technical term, but in simplistic terms it's the honest application of one's mind, setting aside one's past prejudices and present needs, unfettered by any instruction from any outsider, sitting and considering an issue which is before you at the decision-making table, and then listening to your colleagues around the table, their input, and making a decision which you believe is in the best interests of that entity for whom you're appointed. As a trustee of a pension fund, a director of a company, a minister of a government. So it's exactly the same. So the foundation of all this is that intellectual honesty, and you've got to do it with responsibility and being responsive to the situation. Accountability, being accountable to that entity, which usually is an incapacitated, inanimate entity, such as the company or a government itself is inanimate, and it needs politicians and ministers to make it animated. And fairness, the connotation of fairness is that you take account of the needs, interests and expectations of the various stakeholders that are linked to the entity. For example, the government of Mauritius, all the citizens of Mauritius. And then transparency is showing that you are acting in a responsible manner with accountability, etc. And transparency, importance of that is having made a decision in the best interest of that entity, you've got to communicate it to your stakeholders, and you've got to communicate its substance over form, or in simplistic terms, warts and all, positives with the negatives. There's a natural human inclination to try and highlight the positives and massage the negatives. That's the wrong thing to do. You've got to communicate it as the facts are to your stakeholders so they can understand it and then react to to those facts for the entity. So it's a combination of these things, and one mustn't forget that when you have people sitting around a decision-making table, it's a collective decision, and it's a collective mind, and everybody, the chairman of that meeting's main role is to make sure there's a common understanding of that issue. So everybody then focuses on that issue in the same way and then makes a decision. But when something goes wrong, as it does, then one has individual liability and responsibility. And those are the basic principles of governance. And I think just an appreciation that when something goes wrong, as it always does, that you've actually, your personal estate and your personal reputation is on the line. So this should drive one to start acting in a correct manner. And some 10 years ago, I was asked to help Mauritius in formulating its code of corporate governance, which I did do. And so I think Mauritius can be proud that it's at the top echelons at the moment when seen from the outside looking in on the question of governance and how you behave, and so you've attracted financial service industry.
Thank you very much for that quite detailed explanation. Now, Marian Barnor, would you say, for instance, that at home parents are actually the ones that they are part of the governance structure at the very basics?
Everybody must be interested in corporate governance because I believe that it permeates every aspect of life. Now, the values Professor King alluded to are values everybody in society must have. Values of integrity, values of good faith, things that are part of our everyday life. Whether you're a parent, whether you're a businessman, whatever you are, for every individual, you must be interested in corporate governance because it affects you. So whether you're a parent or you're a child or whoever you are, at whatever level, you must be interested in corporate governance.
Mahendra, if I might turn to you, would you agree with what Mariam just said right now about governance?
Let me also say it the other way, that what is governance is not. Governance is not about the arithmetic of the boardroom. Basically, it is in the self-enlightened interest of the company to be socially responsible. For example, customers buy the products of those companies through repeated buying. Employees have loyalty towards that company. Financial institutions and banks like to lend the money to them at a very, very prime rate. So these are the basic interests of the business itself, and therefore to be socially responsible and better governed company is in the self-enlightened interest.
Ansi Ramalho, would you say that governance is part and parcel of life today in the modern world?
I'm a bit of a purist, I'm afraid. So I think if we use the term corporate governance, we talk about governance, what the board does in a corporate context. That's how I understand it. However, I do agree that the principles that underpin sound corporate governance is a way of life. Effective leadership on an ethical foundation, and I think that says it all.
Thank you. And George, what would you say is governance today?
Good governance means good citizenship, just like individuals have got to be good citizens, okay? Corporates also have to be good citizens. They have to apply, as have been said earlier, good ethics, core values, and also that, they have to do business in a sort of transparent, sort of adhering to financial reporting requirements, which are becoming more and more statutory requirements. And also they have to do their share of corporate social responsibility and also be caring for the environment. To us, who are in business, okay, good governance also means that you have to introduce management and risk control.
Now, if I may turn to you again, Professor King, is that somewhere along the lines, governance is essential in business, in government, and also in individuals' lives. How important, how does it affect somebody directly?
Well, it affects every person in the street, because if you do a beneficial download, and most stock exchanges today are operated electronically, and if one does a beneficial download of the equities and who's holding those equities on stock exchanges, one finds that a very large proportion, and a lot of stock exchanges, the majority of the equity is held by pension funds. And that is your money, and every person walking in the street of Port Louis's money, that is in fact providing the capital to companies that are operating here in Mauritius. Now, not only is that person a provider of capital, that person is also the consumer of the company's product. So it is an important stakeholder, the person in the street. And the person in the street can decide whether to buy company A's product or company B's product. The mindset of young people are far different from yours and mine. They have learned things at school that you and I did not learn. They've learned about carbon footprint. They've learned about recycling waste. When those young people today step into managerial and directorship roles, they will steer companies, because that's what boards do, they steer. The Romans said, no wind is a good wind unless you know where you're going to, and that's a director's role. He or she steers a company in a direction. It's very reflective. It's not an activity role, they don't implement. But you've got to steer it in a direction in a triple context. People tonight refer to triple bottom line. That's yesterday's phraseology, with respect. It's, you don't live in isolation. You live in the context of the Mauritian society and the environment. You are dependent on the supply of water here to drink, potable water to drink, to wash your clothes. You're dependent on the society that supports you, and it impacts on you. The company is a person, it's juristic. It's not a human being like you. But you and I directing a company here in Mauritius, we direct it, it's impacting on society and the environment. So every company here in Mauritius is impacting on every person walking in the streets of Port Louis or Curupip or Floreal or wherever it is. And every citizen is impacted on by decisions of politicians, because the politician, a minister, is making a decision on behalf of the government. And there are more stakeholders for state-owned enterprises than there are for companies listed on the Mauritian exchange, simply because every citizen is a stakeholder of a state-owned enterprise. So there's even a more onerous duty on the director of a state-owned enterprise.
Ansi Ramelow, if I can turn to you. We've heard about where Mauritius is in terms of good governance. We've heard about the perceived levels of good governance that there is in Mauritius. You're in charge of the Institute of Directors back in South Africa. What is the perception there towards good governance in South Africa?
I think there's a lot of buy-in into good governance. Our stock exchange, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, is very supportive of it and has actually made our King report, which is our corporate governance standard, compulsory for companies to apply and explain on. Corporate governance, however, is a journey, and especially if you take where corporate governance is going now, the direction in which it's moving is talking less about structures and procedures and more about behavior and culture and the themes that should underlie and underpin good governance, such as sustainability. It's very clear that corporate governance is not something that will be achieved overnight, if ever. It is an aspiration. It's something that companies should continually strive to reach.
Thank you. And Marian, you're from Ghana, a country with plenty of natural resources. Now, are people in Ghana aware of the impact of the use of those resources in terms of governance today?
I think that there's a lot of work to be done in that direction, in terms of raising the level of awareness and in terms of training. Because as we've discussed, corporate governance affects everybody. And it is important that people who are put in a fiduciary position, and in responsible positions should be carefully chosen, they should be trained, and they should accept responsibility for that onerous task placed on them. Because the awareness is coming, it is developing, and the people are getting educated, and they are holding leaders, both political and in the corporate world, responsible, because they appreciate that their lives as individuals, employees, and whatever depends on good governance practices.
George Lansing, you're the chairman of the Mauritius Institute of Directors here. You've heard our foreign guest talk about Mauritius as being an example, in a sense, of good governance. But what would be your appreciation of the levels of good governance in Mauritius?
Yeah, okay. I think myself, first of all, I must mention that, Mauritius, in terms of good corporate governance, have been ranked first in Africa among 53 countries, okay? And for Mauritius, we have no alternative, or we cannot rest on our laurels. What we have to do, we have to continue to adopt good corporate governance, and we must aim at sort of being a regional and even a world reference in terms of corporate governance matters. More and more regional and international players is to adopt good corporate governance, because no sort of world class firms, no big international firms will come to Mauritius if Mauritius sort of is not a sort of reliable jurisdiction, a place where they know that you do business in the proper and correct way.
Thank you. Now, Mahendra Chatham, Vice Chair of the Asian Centre on Corporate Governance. We heard earlier Professor King talk about the change of mindset that is needed at corporate level, at board level, to actually understand that the impact of businesses on individuals and on countries and on resources. Now, this transformation from the way corporate governance was being done in the past to what is today and what it will be in the future, how is this transformation taking place?
I think if corporate governance practiced in its true spirit can be used as the most strategic resource for the company to create a competitive advantage. And in the society, the only entity that creates wealth is the company. And once the creation of the wealth takes place in a value-based manner, then what remains is managing that wealth and distributing that wealth. So the board, they have the responsibility of managing this wealth which is created in a value-based manner for the benefit of the society in an equitable manner. So that's what is all corporate governance about.
I'll turn again to Professor King. Earlier on you said that, or you imputed that good governance, or governance in itself, is not a static thing. It has to change, it keeps changing. Now, you've said yourself earlier on that there were a lot of mistakes that were made in the past, and today we need to change mindset to actually right those wrongs. But is not the same thing going to be said in 20 years' time by the next generation that comes up?
Well, governance is an evolutionary process. It's affected and impacted on by events. If you just take, for example, the global financial crisis, that's created the two major challenges or issues for the 21st century: financial stability and sustainability. Sustainability, if we as directors of companies and as political leaders for governance don't get our value systems right and appreciate that whatever we do impacts not only financially but also from a societal and environmental point of view, then we might not have a sustainable world. Someone asked me to explain it when I was lecturing at a university recently, and they spoke about people, planet and profit. And I said, well, it's very simple. No no planet, no people, no profit. And you start getting an understanding, you know, when you put it in the negative rather than just stating those three aspects. And because it's so evolutionary, you can never master it. It's, I've also said at times you need the strength of Hercules, the wisdom of Solomon, and the agility of a trapeze artist, you know, to really practice governance, because one is dealing with human beings. The company, the government, the tennis club is an inanimate person, juristic person. And it's you and I who animate it. And the juristic person technically is immortal. You and I are mortal. But you are not perfect, nor am I. None of us is perfect. So it's a question of managing human behavior as well. Now that's an extremely difficult practice. It's not a science.
Now, I'll throw an open question. Whoever wants to answer can answer it. To be at the head of a company or being a board director, it involves a lot of responsibility.
Involves leadership.
Now, as you said yourself, changing mindset takes also a lot of time. How do you put those two together?
Well, leadership involves what people often refer to as the tone at the top, or put negatively, the fish rots from the head. That's just the reality. If you have vacuous, incompetent leadership at the top, it's going to go right through your organization. But there are three aspects to it. There's the tone at the top, there's the tune in the middle, and there's the beat of the feet at the bottom. As a leader, you've got to be attuned to all three. Maybe it's my years of experience in corporate life, but give me 48, 72 hours maximum inside an organization, I'll tell you very quickly, if that organization has got its strategy correct and the people have bought into it and they're all facing in the same direction and the morale is good and people feel good being associated with it, when you get morale high and people buy into a strategy, you can get ordinary people to achieve the most extraordinary things. I've been there, I've done it. You can, but if you don't get it right, you don't get buy-in, you don't get pride in that organization, you can have PhDs from the top to the tea lady at the bottom. You will only not even achieve ordinary things. And that's just the reality. So it's about leadership.
Anybody else wants to?
And if I may add, I think that the appointment process in terms of who is the leader is very, very important. Because if the appointment process is wrong, then nothing happens. I mean, failure is staring at you in the face. After the appointment process, there has to be continuous education, there has to be guidelines, and above all, there are certain things that are not taught, but they are values, like integrity. Integrity. You can have your PhD, you can be knowledgeable, but if you do not have integrity, and if you do not have good ethics, you're taking either your country or your company nowhere.
Anybody else?
Quite agree with what Professor King has said, is your whole staff. Because, you know, I worked for an international company before, and we always said we believe everybody can make a difference. And when you say that to the people, you know, from the top to the bottom, they'll then work for you.
At one point here, that if you look at the world population or any country's population, the number of extraordinary people are very little than the ordinary people. Therefore, the art of leadership basically is to get extraordinary work out of the ordinary people. And that's what you exactly do by changing their mindset. And mindset is nothing but the small window through each one of us look at the world. If you can make them look at differently, they will respond differently, and therefore their behavior will become different.
And maybe the word of the end to you, Ansar Ramalo, what would you say about that particular point?
I agree. I think the key is mindset. It's about a behavioral change. For too long, we focused in governance on to having the right committees, having independence. I don't mean independence in mind, but having independence in the outside structures, following the right processes. Those are typically tick-boxing exercises. It needs to come with the right motivation, with the right values and with the right principles. That's the only way that you will achieve the goal that we want to with sound corporate governance.
Maybe Professor King, to end, maybe I'll just throw something at you. Is everybody concerned, every single individual concerned when we talk about governance?
Everyone, every citizen of a country is concerned, because governance, good governance applies to a company. Corporate governance applies to good governance to corporations. But governance generally applies to all entities on planet Earth. And so every citizen in Mauritius is concerned. And it's also a question, I was just listening to Mahendra's comments and Ansi's comments here. Good governance is about quality. It's not about quantity. It's not a quantitative checklist issue. And it's about developing a culture in your organization, which I define as how we do things around here when no one is watching us. And if you can develop a culture of pride and good morale in the company, you can achieve enormous things.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for being with us, Professor Mervin King, George Langshing, Marian Barnor, Ansi Ramalho, and Mahendra Chatham. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.